Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch and YouTube at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Click the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. The 1966 season for the Detroit Lions was, shall we say, a complete and utter disaster. If you ever wondered what the 1960s equivalent of Urban Meyer was, where there was a new controversy and a new case of a coach being completely out of his element and having no idea what he was doing, Harry Gilmer and the Detroit Lions in 1966 was about the closest thing to that. As you can tell from these lowlights, the 1966 season was ugly with a capital U, as the Lions finished the year with a 4-9-1 record, tied with the Minnesota Vikings for the worst record in the West. They had the second worst offense in football, scoring just 206 points in 14 games, just 2 points above the Atlanta Falcons, who were an expansion team, so they get a bit of a pass. Every week, it seemed like someone new was holding out or leaving the team or getting into a fight or feuding with the coaching staff. At one point, the team lost 5 straight games. And things got so bad that after the team lost to the Minnesota Vikings 28-16 in front of their home fans, head coach Harry Gilmer got pelted with snowballs by the fans. Whereas the Lions were a respectable franchise and a perennial contender through the first half of the 1960s, by this point, after what you could argue was their worst season ever at the time, considering all the drama from it, which we'll definitely get to in future videos, they were a laughingstock and were a far cry from their glory days, which seems so long ago. And honestly, when you think about it, it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that the Lions stunk during the regular season in 1966. Because the writing should have been on the wall with what happened during the preseason in the story that we're going to talk about today. Imagine Elton John going on the stage without a piano. It's unnatural. You wouldn't see it. Imagine Bono walking around without his sunglasses. It's unnatural. You wouldn't see it. And imagine a football team going into a season and going into a game with 0 tight ends on their roster. Again, it's unnatural. You wouldn't see it. Well, in 1966, that's exactly what the Lions did, in what can be described as half bad luck and half abysmal roster management. Because this is the story behind one of the strangest roster controversies in the nearly century-long history of the Detroit Lions that you probably did not know about. Before I talk about the incident in question, we need some context to understand, quite simply, what the original game plan for the Lions was heading into the 1966 season. Look, there were a lot of holes for the Lions heading into 1966, and there were a lot of questions that needed to be answered. Milt Plum, at quarterback, was coming off of an absolute stinker of a season, and was throwing his teammates under the bus as much as he was throwing interceptions, which was quite often. The team had no running game to speak of, as no one on the team averaged 4 yards per carry, with the team posting the second worst yards per carry average in football, and with no one on the team even mustering up 500 rushing yards. They had an atrocious kicking game, seeing as they hit on just 36% of their field goals, which was the second lowest percentage in the league, and was well under the league-wide average. And while the pass rush was good, you could sense that they were going to be on the decline, as they were not getting any younger. There were 6 guys on the team to have more than 1 sack in 1965, and the average age of those guys was a whopping 32 years old going into 1966, with only 1 person on the right side of 30. However, I bring all this up because despite the many holes on the Lions that needed to be addressed if they were going to have any chance whatsoever and improving off of a bad 1965 season, and potentially competing with the likes of the Baltimore Colts and the Green Bay Packers for the division crown, there was one position where, on paper, they were perfectly fine. It's the position that you've been watching this whole time. In fact, on paper, they may have had the best 1-2 punch at the position in football, and that was at tight end. Entering the 1966 season, the Lions had 2 tight ends on their roster. Seems a bit odd that they would only carry 2 going into camp with 50 guys, but the 2 tight ends that they had were incredible, and were some of the most feared players in the NFL at their position at their peak. One of them was this man in particular that you've been watching this whole time, former second-round pick Ron Kramer. He had been in the NFL since 1957, spending 7 seasons with the Green Bay Packers, and being an instrumental part in why the Packers were such a dominant team over the first half of the 1960s, winning 2 NFL championships. In fact, during the 1962 season, Kramer was named an AP First-Team All-Pro and a Pro Bowler after a season where he had 7 receiving touchdowns, which was the second best total by any tight end in the league, only behind Joe Walton of the New York Giants, who had 9. By this point in his career, seeing as he was only a few years removed from not just a first-team All-Pro nomination, but a second-team All-Pro nomination in 1963, Kramer had established himself as one of the best tight ends in football, and was showing no signs of slowing down heading into 1966, even if he might not have been the end zone threat that he once was. The Lions were extremely confident with Kramer manning the ship at tight end, and understandably so, considering his prior production and what the Lions had to give up to acquire him in the first place. And the other one? Well, that was this man right here, a Lions legend by the name of Jim Gibbons. Much like Kramer, Gibbons was an established veteran in the league. However, unlike Kramer, Gibbons had spent his whole career in the Motor City with the Detroit Lions, calling Tiger Stadium home for his entire professional career. And much like Kramer, Gibbons was up there with the best tight ends in football. Thus far in his career, he had 274 receptions for 3,414 yards and 19 touchdowns, which was more than Kramer's still highly impressive career line of 188 receptions for 2,800 yards and 16 touchdowns. Just before I go any further, this meant that you had a tight end pairing that was still in the prime of their career that had combined for 4 Pro Bowl appearances, 462 catches, over 6,200 yards, and 35 touchdowns, which was incredible, especially for the mid-1960s, when tight ends were really expected to be more blockers than anything else. Regardless, Jim Gibbons made it to 3 Pro Bowls, including fairly recently during the 1964 season when he finished inside the top 15 of the NFL with 45 receptions, and finished tied for 7th in the league with 8 receiving touchdowns, which was also tied with Pete Retzlaff of the Philadelphia Eagles for the top total amongst all tight ends. In 3 of his most recent 6 seasons, he had at least 45 receptions, or over 3 per game, including a 1960 campaign where he not only finished 4th in the NFL in receptions with 51, but scored the game-winning touchdown late in the 4th quarter in Detroit's classic and stunning upset victory over the Baltimore Colts. Long story short, the Lions were set at tight end. This was the one position where they could absolutely breathe easy and not have to worry about a thing, seeing as Jim Gibbons and Ron Kramer were as reliable as they came. Just how confident were the Lions at tight end? Well, at the 1966 NFL Draft, the Lions had 21 picks, or more than 1 per round, seeing as the draft was 20 rounds back then. During this draft, they spent 6 picks on offensive tackles, truly just throwing darts at the wall and hoping that something stuck. They drafted another offensive lineman for good measure. They drafted 3 running backs. They drafted 4 wide receivers. They drafted 4 defensive linemen. Basically, they were leaving no stone unturned and were drafting at just about every single position, using their surplus of picks to create competition everywhere. That was everywhere except for tight end. Because of the 21 picks that the Lions had in 1966, a grand total of none of them were spent on a tight end, said Russ Thomas, the personnel director for the team, on his philosophy of the draft and his reasoning for doing this, we didn't draft any tight ends because we figured this was one spot where we were set. It's surprising that you wouldn't spend at least one pick just for depth purposes and to possibly mentor for the future, seeing as both Jim Gibbons and Ron Kramer were veterans. But regardless, you get the idea. The Lions love their tight end situation, and were more than comfortable with a 1-2 punch of Gibbons and Kramer, as it might have been one of the best 1-2 punches in football at the position. And the tight ends themselves loved it. Said Gibbons on the situation, "We'd both like to play at the same time. We help each other in practice. If something goes wrong in the pass pattern, we try to spot it and tell the other guy." And said Kramer on the situation and the positional rivalry, "It's all very friendly." However, that's where things sort of went haywire with these two tight ends in Jim Gibbons and Ron Kramer, and where the Lions got themselves into trouble, in what would be a pretty bad omen for how the 1966 season would go. When training camp started, on literally the very first day of camp, this man right here, Jim Gibbons, could not catch a break. He had to be placed in a splint and had to have fluid drained from his knee, and was going to be out for the foreseeable future. Said Gibbons on the injury, "I fell on it and kicked the back of my knee going down. It truly was a freak accident, and it left Gibbons hobbling and with a bruised knee, which obviously is not good. Not only is it not good for the fact that you never like seeing anyone get hurt during camp, especially in a freak injury like that, but because it now leaves you with just one tight end on the entire roster. I don't mean one tight end that they can trust. I mean one tight end, period. Ron Kramer was all that was left for the foreseeable future, which is obviously not ideal, because if for some crazy reason Ron Kramer should go down and suffer an injury, you're left with no one. But surely that can't happen, right? Well, take a wild guess as to what happened next. Because just days after Jim Gibbons suffered his injury and went down, this man right here, Ron Kramer, decided that it was his turn to hop aboard the injury train. During the team's intra-squad scrimmage, which Gibbons was unable to go for due to his injury, Kramer was the team's lone tight end, and would no longer be the tight end afterwards when he broke a bone in the back of his hand. And obviously, that's kind of an important bone to be healthy, seeing as a tight end has to block and has to be able to catch a football, often a hard-thrown football. And it's tough to do that effectively and consistently when you've got a broken hand that you can't really move. The injury forced Kramer into a cast, and forced him to miss a considerable amount of time. And this meant that the Detroit Lions had, you guessed it, 0 tight ends on their entire roster. Within a week, both guys got hurt. And the crazy part, as if this wasn't crazy enough, is that for a good portion of camp, without either of these two guys right here in Ron Kramer and Jim Gibbons, the Lions just went without any tight ends. They didn't think to sign a tight end off the street, nor did they think to convert any of their players on the roster to tight end. They considered briefly trying that with second-year wide receiver John Henderson, who had 140 receiving yards the previous year. But they opted against it, since even though Henderson was 6'3", so he had the height for the position, he was just 195 pounds, so he was not built physically for the position, especially the blocking aspect of it. The Lions just legitimately had no tight ends on their team. Said personnel director Russ Thomas, "We've got 2 big, strong guys there, and figure they wouldn't need any help at tight end. But here we are, with both of them hurt." And when head coach Harry Gilmer was asked about what he was going to do with the position, he said quite bluntly, "Frankly, I don't know. We don't have anyone big enough to play that spot." That's always a good sign, when you've got a head coach throwing his hands up in the air and saying, "Yeah, I've got nothing for this one. We have no one at the position. We have no one capable of doing this. We're completely screwed." Again, a sign of things to come, for just how bad the 1966 season was going to be. Eventually, after playing an entire preseason game and a few practices without any tight ends, things improved somewhat when Gibbons returned from his knee injury and when the team traded a draft pick to the Baltimore Colts for tight end John McGuire, a Syracuse man who was a rookie but was drafted by the team a year before in 1965 with a year left of college eligibility. He never played a single down in professional football. But it's crazy that it took the team this long to sign one, literally one tight end, and that they went a considerable number of practices and even an entire preseason game without having a guy who could play the position. Again, it's not like both guys got hurt during a game and this was a complete fluke. They got hurt at separate times, and the Lions just decided not to address it for some bizarre reason that only Harry Gilmer and Russ Thomas know. Then again, seeing how dysfunctional they were, I'm not sure I want to know the reason behind why they went so long without a tight end, seeing as that was a key part of their offense. Either way, football is a funny game. You can be on top of the world, and one injury can change your entire outlook on a position group. Because the Detroit Lions absolutely experienced this at the tight end position in 1966, when for a rather extended period of time, they had as many tight ends as they currently have Super Bowl wins. 0. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.